On February 9, 2011, police officers made a horrific discovery in a regular apartment in Maywood, USA. Human remains were found in bags in the refrigerator and also on the walls. Satanic symbols were seen everywhere, indicating that a sacrificial ritual had taken place in the house. Amelia Espinosa was a devoted mother, which becomes evident when studying her life. Although most details of this woman's biography remain strictly confidential, we managed to find out that she was apparently born in Mexico in the late 1960s. Like many of her compatriots, she emigrated to the United States, where she spent her entire adult life. She was not alone. According to the limited information available, her other relatives also lived there, and they supported each other. At around 24 years old, Amelia gave birth to her first and only child, the beginning of the 1990s. The young mother decided to name her firstborn Moses in honor of the founder of Judaism. His full name is Moses Miras Espinosa, and from that moment, Amelia dedicated herself entirely to her son, ensuring that the little boy had everything he needed. Not much is known about the father, only his last name, Miras. The information suggests that he was not always present in Moses' life, but they maintained a relationship and communicated, especially during difficult times. Over time, the small family found their home in Maywood, a small town in southeast Los Angeles, California. There, in a pink apartment complex next to an alley, mother and son moved into apartment number 11. The neighbors soon witnessed Amelia's devotion to her firstborn, but it later turned out that the boy had a fondness for a type of creepy music, which deeply disturbed the woman. She was ashamed that he disturbed the peace of society in this way. As is often the case with teenagers, Moses' musical preferences prevailed. There was no shortage of people who labeled the young man's peculiar taste as an obsession, especially for heavy metal. In return, Moses delved deeper into the world of death metal, an extreme subgenre characterized by distorted sound from low-tuned guitars. When he turned up the volume, no one nearby could ignore this music. In the heavy metal universe, King Diamond became Moses' favorite singer. His real name is Kim Bendix Peterson, a Danish musician considered one of the 100 most influential metal singers due to his distinctive voice, bizarre makeup, lyrics, and special effects in his songs. He is regarded as a unique representative of the genre, but an aspect that certainly cemented his fame was his peculiar view of Satanism. King Diamond was especially a follower of the atheistic Satanism movement, founded in the 1960s by American occultist and writer Anton LaVey. This cult had its own satanic Bible, and for King, it was not just a religion, but a philosophy of life. This made him one of the true representatives of satanic metal rock in the 1980s. In his scandalous and deeply blasphemous lyrics, Anton LaVey explained his tolerance towards various religious beliefs and also pointed out that what he considered truly alarming was humanity's ability to destroy each other in the name of God. Amelia was extremely worried about her son's strange taste and tried to convince him to diversify his musical choices, but according to neighbors, this made him angry. Moses had now chosen the dark side of his rock metal star legacy, and one of the first things he did was to buy a satanic Bible. Additionally, he added God Grin to the catalog of his preferences, a musical subgenre from the late 1980s, where the voices are so subdued that they create a frightening and even oppressive atmosphere, similar to the voices traditionally used in horror films for devilish or possessed characters. According to analysts, death metal represents fear and a certain desire to control everything perceived as a threat. Its symbolism is full of scenarios of death, destruction, supernatural horror, and violence in general. This was the world Moses immersed himself in day after day. Furthermore, he was always dressed in black and covered his body with tattoos featuring symbols that his mother found disturbing. At that time, Amelia worked as a seamstress and was a mother like any other. She always cooked meals for her son, washed his clothes, and took care of him. To their neighbors, she was a charming woman, and the impression of Moses was that he was an ordinary young man like most of the area's residents. Although Amelia neither understood nor shared her son's taste, she generally treated him with enough respect. The real reason for their frequent arguments was the music the young man listened to at full volume, especially since it disturbed the neighbor's peace. However, all other aspects of Moses' daily life, be it his social life, interests, dreams, fears, or even his psychological profile, could not be uncovered. Some reports indicate that he met a girl named Monica around mid-2010. They fell in love so deeply that they soon lived together and then both got jobs at a cookie factory. Day by day, the couple left the house with high spirits, holding hands and making plans for the future on the way. It seemed that Moses was on the right path. As his colleague Alfonso Baltasar observed, it didn't take long for the man to prove himself. He was punctual, never missed work, took his job seriously, and soon his supervisors began considering promoting him. At the same time, he and Monica wanted to study. But one day, the girl was hit by a car on the way to the factory, and it was not possible to save her. Since then, the young man's behavior changed. It is unclear whether this had happened before, but it is clear that Moses became heavily involved in the consumption of illegal psychoactive substances to cope with the pain of losing his soulmate. From that point on, violent outbursts became increasingly frequent and difficult to control. Amelia was exhausted and confused. At the age of 18, Moses locked himself in the house and within himself, and within those four walls, quarrels between him and his mother became a daily occurrence. Meanwhile, another person was worried about Moses's behavior. Liliana Rivera, his cousin, the only relative besides Amelia whose name was revealed. At the same time, rumors among the neighbors already suggested that Amelia was afraid of her son, who was becoming increasingly aggressive and disrespectful. In late 2010, Liliana began to fear that he might harm himself or someone else because he was too involved in the satanic world. Wednesday, February 2, 2011, was not much different from any other day in the family. Moreover, there was another fierce argument between Moses and his mother. Everything indicates that Amelia once again reproached him for the loud music from his room. But this time, evil finally found a willing servant. For no apparent reason, Moses drew the curtains, turned up the volume even more, and used a rope to block the blood flow to the neck of his then 42-year-old mother. The cries for help of the woman who gave him life were drowned out by the deep chords and the voice of King Diamond from the speakers. In the end, Amelia succumbed to the attack by the person she loved most in the world. After what happened, Moses went to bed. Over the next 2 days, he considered various ways to dispose of the body. His gaze was lost until finally, his insight and instinct gave him the answer. Armed with power tools, he disposed of the remains. The operation was carried out in the bathroom. Packaged parts were then placed in the living room freezer, and then everything happened as prescribed in satanic rituals, with the use of crosses and symbols. But after a few days, Moses began to doubt his method and wondered how long he could endure like this. He climbed onto the roof of the house, put a flower pot on his head, and sat there for quite some time. Neighbors noticed his strange behavior, but assumed he was probably under the influence of illegal substances. Epifanio Hernandez, the manager of the apartment complex, told ABC News that he spoke to the young man for several days because he needed to enter the house. Moses came up with all sorts of excuses to keep him out. The neighbors were equally concerned when they saw that Amelia had not left the house for several days. They came and asked if she was okay and if they could visit her. But Moses didn't let anyone into the apartment. Epifanio explained that he was installing new sinks in all the kitchens of the apartments and insisted on entering Amelia's house, but the guy told him to come next week. All these people's concern for his mother and the urgent work of installing a new sink made Moses think it was urgently necessary to remove Amelia's remains from the house. Then he remembered that his cousin Liliana was a follower of Santeria. It was not clarified whether his concern was to get rid of problems or if it was merely to confirm his absurd act. In any case, he contacted Liliana and asked what the worst thing followers of Santeria had ever done. Given his behavior and his peculiar approach to the conversation, Liliana immediately got into her car and headed to her cousin's house. Moses was waiting in front of the house when she arrived. Liliana asked where her aunt was, to which she replied that she was not at home. But the girl had a premonition, and this time it was very bad. She insisted and asked where she was. When Moses said that Amelia had just left, Liliana felt a wave of fear wash over her. Soon, Moses confessed what he had done, but she didn't believe him. The girl said that couldn't be true. Then Liliana, with a trembling voice, asked how it happened, and Moses began to describe the entire sequence of events in detail, including the fate of the bones, skin, and weapons he used. Her cousin didn't miss any detail. He even told her that the music was used to drown out the menacing noise of the chainsaw and to avoid arousing suspicion among the neighbors. At the end of his story, Moses made a statement that was no less horrifying than the story itself. He said that after the fatal attack on his mother, he felt at peace. Moreover, he claimed that from the moment of the act, he felt like an angel. It had already been about a week, and then he asked Liliana to help him dispose of the remains. In a state of shock, with barely audible trembling in her voice, she managed to convince him to surrender, and she took him to the Huntington Park police station in South Los Angeles. Upon arrival, even before they entered the police station, Moses called his father and told him that Amelia was no longer among the living. She was sleeping, and that he had helped her leave. Since his words were quite confusing and interrupted by sobs, it was difficult for the father to understand what he was talking about. A few minutes later, Moses entered the police station. Clock showed exactly 1 p.m. when he confronted the first officer he encountered. He gave a detailed account of the crime he had committed, and when an officer arrived to take him to East Los Angeles, he was asked if he knew why he was being arrested. Moses once again answered truthfully and openly. To this officer, the guy provided an additional detail he hadn't mentioned before. Since the remains were still in the apartment he shared with his mother, the police immediately went to the house and found what can only be described as the epitome of a horror movie. In the middle of the living room lay a toppled refrigerator on the floor, and like an evil aura that one could not get rid of or even forget, stench permeated every air particle. When they opened the refrigerator, they found plastic bags containing the remains. More bags were found on the walls, a circular saw with blood, flesh, and bone fragments, and a knife in the shower. The walls in the bathroom were covered with plastic sheeting, kind painters used to protect against paint splatters, and secured with tape. Additionally, blood particles were visible in this part of the house. Further, in the adjacent room, there was a rack, and on it, the police found human bones and a skull with painted crosses. The officers also found an aerosol cleaner, which likely indicated an attempt to cover up the incident. In a search of Moses' bedroom, next to his laptop, a collection of disturbing items was found, including DVD of the movie Saw and a satanic Bible, the chapter on human sacrifice marked. Given everything they had observed so far, it was impossible to overlook the drawings on the closet door. All the images there were related to diabolical beliefs. When the neighbors saw the police officers, they said that Amelia had been afraid of her son's outbursts of aggression and had scolded him for going out at night to meet people with a dubious reputation for illegal substance consumption. Hours later, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department confirmed to the media that the body had been found. Coroner Brian Elias warned that the body could not be properly identified as it had been dismembered. As expected, the news caused an outcry. Meanwhile, Moses was detained by the sheriff and arrested on suspicion of committing the violent acts that led to his mother Amelia's death. After the news hit TV screens and public interest surged, many journalists attempted to contact the victims' relatives, hoping to shed light on this dark event. However, the only one who agreed to speak, although she refused to reveal her name or even show her face, was Liliana. Finally, autopsy results were released, and the forensic investigation revealed the cause of death to be asphyxiation, due to compression of the neck. It also described in detail all the manipulations done to the body. Meanwhile, the prosecution, ahead of the trial, tried to present numerous photos of the remains as evidence. After reviewing the images, the lower court excluded several of them. deeming them excessively violent. According to the prosecutor handling the case, Herb Marr, Moses's fatal attack on his mother was neither in the heat of passion nor impulsive or reckless. He argued that it was carried out with the intention of devotion to all dark forces, and was therefore the ultimate sacrifice. On Tuesday, February 8, 2011, Moses was officially charged with murder, but, incredibly, he pleaded not guilty. Bail in this case was set at $1 million, a figure typically set in cases where authorities are trying to keep a suspect behind bars due to their dangerousness. As a result, Moses was placed in custody at a correctional facility, with his next appearance before the East Los Angeles Municipal Court scheduled for February 23rd. If convicted of the brutal killing of his mother, he faced a maximum sentence of 25 years to life imprisonment. Already during the trial, the jury was shocked by the detailed report of the pathologist who testified about the deplorable condition of the body he had examined. For example, he mentioned that the fingertips appeared to have been individually removed, the sharp instrument, the entire scalp had been removed except for the eyelids. All the teeth had been extracted with their roots. Then, the testimony of an expert in the study of ritual symbols and unknown practices was presented, concluding that the position of the body suggested that Moses' actions were of a ritualistic nature. According to the specialist, each of the man's actions had magical significance for the perpetrator and was generally a necessary function of the ritual. This meant that dismemberment and other actions were not intended to make evidence disappear, but had ritual significance, served some purpose, and were primarily a form of worship. The absolute horror was evident on the faces of both the judge and the other attendees in the courtroom. When asked about the disposal of the body in the present case, the expert stated that the measures taken went far beyond what was necessary for the simple disposal of a body. Moreover, the expert identified some of the symbolic images found on Moses's laptop, in other parts of the apartment, and on the walls as satanic symbols or traces linked to similar beliefs. Some of them were associated with the musician King Diamond, whom the expert described as a self-proclaimed follower of the Satanist Anton LaVey. Then the expert presented new information that shocked everyone even more. He explained that the date of the incident, February 2nd, indicated that the fatal attack on Amelia was not random but deliberate, as it coincided with a satanic holiday requiring very specific rituals, including human or animal sacrifice. At this point, Moses' lawyer, Jonathan Roberts, interjected, arguing that his client's involvement with the Satanic Church had been exaggerated, and adding that modern Satanists do not permit human sacrifice. The truth was that after hearing all the expert testimonies, examining the evidence, and listening to the arguments from both sides, it took the Superior Court only one day to find Moses Miras Espinosa guilty of first-degree murder of his mother, Amelia Espinosa. During sentencing, Los Angeles Supreme Court Judge Thomas McNew described the case as one of the most heinous, cruel, and vulgar he had encountered in nearly 50 years of his career. He sentenced Moses to life imprisonment, the possibility of parole, after 25 years. Before being taken out of the courtroom, the judge spoke directly to Moses, telling him that although he didn't know how he could change his life, he now had time to think about it. Moses' father was present in the courtroom, as were several family members. The young man looked at them as he was led out of the courtroom, said nothing.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel, and take care of yourselves. See you in the next video.
Today, things are about to get really intense. So for the first time on this channel, I must warn you that if you're sensitive to tragedy, you might want to refrain from watching this video. For those who wish to stay, welcome to my channel where I cover real crimes and strange phenomena. If you like what I say, please subscribe. Let's begin. The Japanese have long been known for their dedication to work. The term karoshi, death by overwork, was coined in Japan in the 1970s to describe deaths caused by exhaustion from excessive work. I think you've heard of it. Managers force their employees to perform tasks beyond their duties and encourage them to arrive at work earlier than scheduled. Leaving work on time, on the other hand, is frowned upon. When deadlines are pressing, it's considered perfectly normal to sleep at work. Despite the negative impact on society and the collective mental health of Japanese workers, this unhealthy tradition persists to this day. And sometimes they say that bad experiences are also experiences. Ultimately, you analyze your mistakes and move on, keeping in mind what you've learned. But some mistakes are so devastating that you can only watch in horror as everything slowly collapses. In 1999, a combination of negligence, corporate greed, and complete disregard for worker safety resulted in unimaginable suffering for one person. On the morning of September 30, 1999, technician Hisashi Aochi, his colleague Masada Shinohara, and their supervisor Yutaka Yakakawa arrived at the Takaimura nuclear power plant. It was a completely normal workday. I'm not a chemist or physicist, but I'll explain to you how I understood it. One of the plant's facilities was dedicated to processing uranium. This was then processed into fuel rods that were used in other nuclear power plants and reactors. There was no personnel specially trained for this task. This work was done by whatever technicians had time. The process was strictly regulated. What had to be transferred into which container and when and for how long did everything have to be mixed? 3 years before the tragedy, the company changed the official procedure so that the uranium nitrate solution could now be prepared manually in stainless steel containers, rather than as before by placing the ingredients in a special container to dissolve. This was illegal to say the least and contrary to government regulations. However, because the uranium concentration always remained extremely low, this change had never led to any accidents. When the 3 workers arrived that day, the factory was already 2 days behind schedule for delivering the nuclear fuel. The company put pressure on the employees to complete the process as quickly as possible. So, the technicians changed the process even more drastically. Now, instead of just preparing the solution by hand in buckets, they poured it directly into the settling tank. Furthermore, they used a uranium concentration 7 times higher than permitted to speed up production. And as you can imagine, this had tragic consequences. At around 10:35 a.m., Aochi and Shinohara were mixing uranium powder in buckets exceeding the permissible concentration by 7 times. Aochi leaned against the settling tank and helped Shinohara, who was standing on a platform pouring the mixture in. Suddenly, the gamma alarm went off. Aochi, Shinozaki, and Yakakawa realized they had made a terrible mistake. All 3 reportedly saw a flash of blue light, the so-called Vavilov-Cherenkov effect. This releases enormous amount of energy, creating a shock wave similar to the sonic boom of a supersonic aircraft or a bullet. This confirms that an uncontrolled chain reaction had taken place, contaminating the room with lethal doses of gamma rays. Aochi, who was closest to the explosion site, received the highest dose. Shinohara, who was next to standing there, received slightly less. Yakakawa was sitting at his computer several meters away from them and therefore received the lowest dose of radiation. To illustrate, the internationally accepted limit for radiation safety per person per year is 20 millisieverts. The lethal dose is 5,000 millisieverts. Aochi received 17,000 millisieverts of radiation in one moment, which is 3 times the lethal dose. Shinohara received 10,000 and Yakakawa 3,000. 3 men immediately ran but could not get far. Aochi and Shinohara immediately felt a burning pain all over their bodies. They became nauseous and had difficulty breathing. Yakakawa also felt the effects, although not as severely. Aochi entered the locker room where he vomited and fell unconscious on the floor. The factory was immediately evacuated to repair the damage and prevent radiation The exposure to other employees. Aochi, Shinohara, and Yakakawa were taken to the National Institute of Radiation Research in Chiba. However, due to his critical condition, Aochi was quickly transferred to the University of Tokyo Hospital, where better qualified staff and more modern equipment were available for his treatment. On the evening of September 30, Aochi arrived at the University of Tokyo Hospital. He was brought in on a stretcher and placed in a private room in the intensive care unit. There, he was cared for by a nurse. She noted that, apart from his swollen hand and what appeared to be recently burned skin, the man appeared well. He was alert, talkative, and friendly. One of the nurses even said that she thought he could have been discharged home that same day. Unknowingly, they were laying the foundation for one of the most horrific deaths in history. When doctors learned that Aochi had suffered an accident at a nuclear power plant, they examined his bone marrow to determine the cause. What they discovered horrified them. The doctors realized that Aochi was no ordinary case. The human body is made up of countless cells that die but are replaced by new ones over time. This is made possible by our body's chromosomes, which dictate the regeneration process. If the chromosomes aren't functioning properly, a person simply can't survive. Aochi's chromosomes were so badly damaged by the radiation blast that his samples looked like soup. Some of them shattered into pieces like glass, flying in all directions and becoming almost impossible to identify. Some were abnormally fused together. There were simply no blueprints left for cell replication and repair, and the chromosomes had become unusable. The doctors simply couldn't believe what they were seeing. If the damage was so severe, why did Aochi, according to the nurses, appear healthy and in excellent spirits? Well, the doctors agreed that the man was in a ghost state, a period of health that can last from several hours to several days, depending on the body's response to the radiation poisoning. Before the explosion, Hisashi's cells were still functioning, so the health he displayed upon arrival at the hospital was short-lived. Once the radiation poisoning began to take effect, everything would change. Simply put, he was a time bomb and his terrible ordeal was about to begin. In addition to the loss of chromosome functionality, the man's white blood cell count dropped dangerously low, making him extremely vulnerable to infection and disease. To improve the situation, the attending chief physician, Dr. Kazuhiko Mikawa, ordered him to be moved to a sterile room where he would be constantly protected from external pathogens and bacteria. After eliminating the possibility of infection, Dr. Mikawa realized that to give the patient a chance of survival, his body needed to be supplied with healthy chromosomes that could cause his body to produce cells again and regenerate. He then decided to try an experimental cancer treatment. A procedure called hematopoietic stem cell transplantation was required. Healthy bone marrow cells would be removed from a donor and transplanted into Aochi. The healthy cells would be transferred to his bone marrow and ideally enable him to produce his own healthy cells again. The only limitation to this then cutting-edge treatment method was that the donor had to be immunologically compatible. Fortunately, Hisashi had a sister whom the doctors deemed suitable and the operation could proceed. The family was concerned that Aochi was the first patient in the world to receive such a treatment. Knowing full well the damage the radiation had caused to his body, Dr. Mikawa made sure the family could see him daily. He knew that false hope would exacerbate an already difficult situation and wanted his family to see the changes and prepare for the worst in advance. The man himself didn't seem to grasp the gravity of his situation. One of the nurses noted that he once asked, "I thought I could be discharged from the hospital in about a month, but it's going to take longer, isn't it?" Later, after his radiation treatment, he asked, "With that kind of radiation, is there a risk of developing leukemia or something else?" Aochi didn't know that he simply wouldn't have enough time to develop leukemia. Over time, physical symptoms of radiation poisoning also appeared. Auchai's skin lost its elasticity and began to peel off. The doctors noticed that when he removed the medical tape, large pieces of skin peeled off, so they stopped using it and stopped using anything at all. Later, his lungs filled with fluid and he had difficulty breathing. By this time, he was already finding it difficult to move and even speak. However, his will to live seemed undiminished. He continued to smile and tell his wife, "I love you." According to the nurses, this was very moving. Soon as fluid steadily accumulated in his lungs, Auchai completely lost the ability to breathe. Doctors then decided to put him on a ventilator. An endoscopy was also performed, which revealed that the intestinal lining, a surface critical for absorption, digestion, and even protection against microbial infections, had died and was peeling off. Without it, humans cannot absorb nutrients from food or absorb water. Ultimately, such a loss of fluid and nutrients can lead to dehydration or starvation and ultimately death. But as it turned out, death would have been far better than what Auchai had to endure over the next few days. To determine what had gone wrong, Dr. Mikawa performed another test. He found that the healthy chromosomes that had been transplanted into his body were now also damaged by the radiation. Despite his best efforts, his body had been so severely damaged by the radiation blast that even the healthy transplanted cells were affected. This meant that Auchai was back to square one. Dr. Mikawa was distraught knowing he had to break this terrible news to his family, who had only just begun to regain hope. Meanwhile, Auchai was developing problems with his gastrointestinal tract. He lost control of his bowels and suffered from round-the-clock diarrhea. In addition, the detached intestinal lining caused internal bleeding. He was losing a lot of blood quickly, so Dr. Mikawa had to administer transfusions. Imagine that, sometimes up to 10 times a day. Under these circumstances, he was constantly being administered fentanyl to relieve the pain. But his skin and flesh continued to blister and peel, leaving his body unable to retain fluids. He was in danger of completely dying to dehydrate. The man reportedly lost 8 to 10 liters of fluid per day, which had to be administered via an IV drip. The remaining layers of skin, medical staff wrapped almost his entire body in medical gauze, hoping this would hold the skin in place while helping to retain fluid. But this didn't help. The bandages were completely soaked with blood after just a few hours. The fluid loss was so severe that doctors had to measure the amount to know how much needed to be pumped back. By this point, Auchai was already hopeless. A nurse wrote down his words, "No more, I'm going home, please stop." It is reported that Auchai cried out for his mother in a state of delirium. Because his skin had lost its elasticity, he could no longer close his eyelids and reportedly cried blood. Because of the severe pain, he was given large doses of various medications to help him sleep and reduce his suffering. Dr. Mikawa spoke to Auchai's family and told them that his condition was unlikely to improve and would most likely only worsen. The family begged him to do whatever he could to save Auchai's life, but the only thing he could attempt was a massive skin graft using lab-grown skin. Dr. Mikawa hoped that if the skin grew, it would retain fluid and buy time to find other ways to help him. Unfortunately, due to the massive fluid loss from the open wounds, the skin did not grow back and quickly fell off. 2 months had passed since Auchai was admitted to the hospital. He received repeated blood transfusions, skin grafts, and stem cell transplants. He was on a ventilator, his skin was rotting, and his eyes couldn't even close while he slept because he had no eyelids. Blood flowed from his intestines and he was in constant burning pain, but he was alive. The massive blood loss and constant blood transfusions had a secondary effect. Auchai's heart beat at a rate of over 120 beats per minute, like running a marathon. The strain on the heart muscle was simply catastrophic, and then it stopped. The doctors had no orders not to resuscitate him, so they were simply obligated to do whatever it took to bring him back to life. They quickly performed CPR and his heart began beating again, but then it stopped again. The team administered cardiac medication, and after stopping and restarting 3 times, his heart returned to a steady but very rapid beat. The stopping and restarting of the heart had a negative impact on Auchai's brain and kidney function. The overall function of his organs began to decline. When his family visited him, he didn't even recognize them, and he probably didn't understand anything at all. At this point, his survival depended entirely on medical devices. Auchai's immune cells became abnormal and attacked his remaining healthy leukocytes. Within a short time, he had run out, and even a common cold could have killed him within hours. On the 81st night after his admission to the hospital, Dr. Mikawa gathered the family and informed them that Hisashi Auchai could not be saved, and that if his heart stopped again, it should not be resuscitated. The family agreed and signed a non-resuscitation order, hoping to spare him further suffering. And so it was that on the 83rd day of this nightmare, Hisashi Auchai's heart stopped beating. He was dead. It's hard to say who bears the blame in this story. Of course, the factory where Auchai worked bears the brunt of the blame, but should we blame the doctors who used every means possible to save him, or his family who dreamed of his recovery and clung to every straw? What? I don't know. I only know one thing: nobody deserves this. And the more people know about it, the fewer such cases there will be in the future. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves. On the evening of July 29, 2014, an elderly couple living in an apartment building in the western part of Pochin City, Gyeonggi Province, South Korea, were getting ready for bed. It was still hot outside, so the apartment windows were open. The couple heard a child crying somewhere. At first, they tried to ignore it, but it grew louder and louder. The couple realized the noise was coming from the neighboring apartment on the second floor. They tried knocking on the door, but no one answered, and the crying grew louder and louder. People clearly heard the voice of a little boy repeatedly calling, "Where is my mommy? I want to go to my mommy." This seemed strange to them because everyone knew the apartment belonged to a woman who rarely visited. No one had seen the child with her. Neighbors called emergency services. Police and an ambulance quickly arrived at the house. After several unsuccessful attempts to gain entry, they decided to break down the door, but it was firmly locked. Seeing no other option, the police officers decided to use a fire escape to enter the apartment through a window. Once inside, they saw a room crammed with junk. Huge blue bags filled with garbage were everywhere. The foul stench made breathing impossible. The floors and doors were rotten, the walls cracked, and the furniture covered with a thick layer of dust and mold. It was hard to believe anyone could live in such conditions. Following the sounds of crying, the police found a young boy in the master bedroom. He looked 5 or 6 years old. He was very thin and weak, and his ribs were clearly visible. His eyes were cloudy and slightly blue, and his gaze was unfocused. Despite the commotion around him, the boy didn't immediately notice that people were nearby. He continued to cry and stare at the television screen. When he saw the police officers, his crying grew even louder. He was afraid of the uninvited guests. The police officers gently and carefully calmed the child. When they asked him why he was alone, he mumbled something unintelligible. Given the boy's critical condition, he was immediately taken to the hospital and fed. Everyone was surprised at how he handled his food. He carefully divided it into small portions, eating only one and leaving the rest for later. The medical staff tried to persuade the child to eat a whole portion at once, but he refused. This continued for a while. He stubbornly stuck to his method of dividing the food. After the boy was taken to the hospital, the police began to search the apartment. At first, they thought the source of the unbearable stench was the piles of garbage, but when they entered the second room opposite the master bedroom, the smell became many times worse. The officers carefully opened the door. This room, too, was littered with garbage. In the middle stood a large red plastic container, 90 centimeters high and 80 centimeters in diameter. Such containers are used for preparing the Korean national dish, kimchi, in very large quantities. It stood out clearly from the general chaos. Next to it lay a cell phone. On the lid of the container was a 10-kilogram bag of salt. The police decided to take a look inside. There they found a purple blanket, and underneath it, a body in advanced decomposition, submerged in a liquid. The container was taken away for further examination and forensic analysis. When they turned it over to drain the liquid and remove the remains, everyone saw a jumble of human bones and 2 skulls. It became clear that there were 2 bodies in the container. They were stacked on top of each other with a thin blanket between them that served as a kind of partition. The forensic examination revealed that the remains belonged to men between 40 and 50 years old. The victim on top had died about a year ago. 3 loops were formed from a scarf around the neck, and the head was tightly wrapped in plastic wrap. The victim lying underneath had died about 10 years ago. The container was filled with salt, which, together with the body fluids, had formed a foul-smelling broth. The murderer probably covered the bodies with salt to slow the decomposition process. 1 finger survived from the body lying on top. A partial fingerprint was visible on it. This was forwarded to the relevant authorities to attempt to reconstruct the complete print. This would help determine the victim's identity. News of the horrific discovery in one of the city apartments quickly spread throughout the area. The police immediately formed a 60-member special task force. Their first task was to thoroughly question the people who lived near the apartment where the incident had occurred. They hoped to find the boy's parents, who were most likely involved in the murder of the 2 men who had been preserved in a container. According to neighbors, the apartment belonged to a 51-year-old woman named Ms. Lee, who hadn't lived there for a long time. She used to come by every few days, spend only a few minutes in the apartment, and then leave. She was last seen 20 days ago. Ms. Lee was found to have a 28-year-old son who lives in the city of Masan. Police tracked him down. And he said the boy they found was his younger brother, who is actually 8 years old. They have the same mother but different fathers. The 8-year-old boy's father was not involved in his upbringing. Shortly after his son's birth, the man's visa expired, so he returned home and cut off contact with Ms. Lee. When asked about his biological father, the boy replied that his name was Mr. Park. He hadn't heard from him in 10 years. The boy lived with his mother until he was 18, after which he moved to Masan to live with his grandparents. He admitted that he never paid much attention to his younger brother. He rarely had contact with his mother. Little is known about Ms. Lee. She was born in Jeonju in 1963. After moving to Pochin, she found work at a confectionery factory. She suffered from chronic depression and had a volatile personality which made people reluctant to deal with her. The situation with her husband was very mysterious and strange. After moving to Pochin, Mr. Park found work at a pig farm. After some time, he disappeared without a trace. Mr. Park's parents said they lost contact with their son 10 years ago. He had a mistress with whom he eloped. Police tried to track Mr. Park down using bank statements and medical records but found nothing. His trail went cold in 2004. It was later discovered that the cell phone found near a container in Ms. Lee's apartment belonged to Mr. Park. It continued to be paid for until 2013. A call came in from the same number at regular intervals. The police discovered that this number belonged to a man who had worked with Ms. Lee. He was tracked down and interrogated. He said Ms. Lee had given him the number and asked him to call regularly, paying him a small sum of money for this. Usually no one answered the phone, and only in 2013 did a woman call and tell him not to call again. Since the phone was found in Ms. Lee's apartment, it was clear that she answered the call. But why she had done all this remained. Mystery. The police issued a nationwide arrest warrant for Ms. Lee. Since it was known that she worked at a local candy factory, the officers went there immediately, but it turned out that she had left work an hour early that day. To determine where Ms. Lee had gone, the police reviewed street surveillance camera footage and saw her leave the factory premises and quickly walk toward the dormitories where mainly immigrants live. At some point, Ms. Lee disappeared from view, but the police were certain that she had not left the industrial area and immediately deployed all forces to the area. They searched the dormitories and questioned the factory workers, but they could not find Ms. Lee. Then the police decided to track her cell phone, but it had been switched off for several days. The call log showed that Ms. Lee called the same person every day at about the same time and spoke with him for about 10 minutes. Investigators quickly identified the man and visited him at his home. He was a 44-year-old man from Sri Lanka who had come to South Korea to work in a textile factory. He lived in a dormitory in an industrial area where Ms. Lee had last been seen. The police suspected that Ms. Lee was hiding with this man and wanted to search the apartment, but he just shook his head and said he didn't understand Korean. 2 days later, the police returned with a search warrant. The man silently opened the door wider and pointed to a closet. Inside, they found Ms. Lee. Since she was wearing only underwear, it was assumed she had hastily hidden when she heard the knock on the door. Ms. Lee was arrested and taken to the police station. She repeatedly repeated the same phrase, "I'm so sorry." During interrogation, she was first asked why her 8-year-old son had been alone in the apartment for at least 20 days. She replied, "I thought he was dead, so I didn't want to go back there." The woman could not offer a plausible explanation for why the child was in such terrible condition. By the time Ms. Lee began asking questions about the bodies found in a container, investigators had already identified one of the victims. Experts were able to reconstruct the fingerprint of a man whose remains were found in the upper part of the container. This was 49-year-old Mr. Lee, her lover. He had once worked with Ms. Lee at the candy factory and had been her lover. Ms. Lee said she began a romantic relationship with Mr. Lee in 2012. They moved in together 2 months later. Ms. Lee suggested Mr. Lee give her his salary so she could manage their joint budget for all expenses. The man agreed but later regretted it. At work, the two had to keep their relationship secret because company policy prohibited dating colleagues. When the director accidentally found out about the affair, he considered Mr. Lee's behavior inappropriate and immediately fired him. According to the documents, Ms. Lee was still married, even though her husband was reported missing. The director believed Mr. Lee had exploited her vulnerability for his own purposes. The couple's relationship continued for a while but gradually began to deteriorate. Mr. Lee couldn't find a new job, started drinking, and blamed Ms. Lee for everything. The woman was tired of putting up with it and left Mr. Lee in May 2013. The man was furious. He believed that he had lost his job because of Ms. Lee and that she had now left him. Mr. Lee also began to suspect that Ms. Lee was cheating on him. He gave her his entire salary and she used it as she saw fit. The man believed she now owed him 4.5 million won, equivalent to more than $3,000 in current dollars. Ms. Lee tried to explain that the money had been used for their shared living arrangements, including her salary, and so she wouldn't pay anything back, but Mr. Lee refused to listen. For the next 2 months, he terrorized Ms. Lee. He visited her at work and home, demanding repayment of the debt. Each of their meetings inevitably ended in a heated argument. In July 2013, Mr. Lee came to Ms. Lee's home and demanded his money back. The woman tried to remain calm. She offered the man a seat and a drink. He agreed, but he persisted. Mr. Lee begged Ms. Lee to return the money and threatened her. At one point, the woman said firmly, "If you continue to behave like this, I will not return the money. I will kill you and then do the same to myself." When Mr. Lee heard these words, he could no longer contain his anger. He cursed and slapped Ms. Lee violently in the face. Unable to bear this humiliation, Ms. Lee suddenly stood up and threw Mr. Lee to the ground with all her strength. She sat on him and began choking him with both hands. Then she took a scarf, wrapped it around his neck 3 times, and pulled it tight. Mr. Lee struggled desperately, but his body seemed to no longer obey him and his limbs went limp. It turned out that Ms. Lee had slipped strong sleeping pills into his drink. When the man showed no signs of life, Ms. Lee stood up. She looked at his body and felt no remorse. To make sure he didn't regain consciousness, she wrapped his head tightly in plastic wrap. She then wrapped the body blanket and carried it to the guest room. For a while, Ms. Lee ignored her former lover's lifeless body, but when it began to decompose and emit a foul odor, she decided to place it in a plastic container. She sprinkled a large amount of salt over it, hoping it would dampen the smell, and sealed the container tightly. After hearing this story, the police officers asked Ms. Lee about the other victim whose remains were at the bottom of the container. She calmly replied that it was a foreigner she had met by chance on the street. He had demanded money from her, but Ms. Lee had refused to give him any. A fight had broken out and she had accidentally killed the man. While she was wondering what to do with the body, a stranger came by. Ms. Lee asked for his help, promising him $1 million. About $720 today. According to Ms. Lee, the man helped her drag the body into her apartment and place it in a kimchi container. The police listened to Ms. Lee's story and realized she was lying, but they had no evidence. Fortunately, the situation soon changed. Forensic experts managed to secure DNA from the second victim, and after an examination, they were able to determine his identity. The body belonged to Mr. Park, Ms. Lee's husband. When the woman was questioned again, she changed her story but assured investigators that she had not harmed him. One morning 10 years ago, Ms. Lee had found her husband on the balcony. He showed no signs of life. Shocked, she didn't know what to do. Out of love for her husband, she placed his body in a container, hoping he would stay with her forever. Ms. Lee's story sounded implausible. The police again doubted the veracity of her statement, but still had no evidence against her. Meanwhile, forensic pathologists continued to examine the bodies of Mr. Lee and Mr. Park to determine the cause of death. On August 7, they informed police that doxylamine had been found in their bodies. This is a chemical component of prescription sleep aids, which have a sedative effect and help people fall into a deep sleep quickly. However, in an overdose, doxylamine inhibits respiratory function, which can lead to a coma and even death. It turned out that Ms. Lee had been taking a doctor-prescribed sleep aid containing doxylamine for many years. In addition, a week before Mr. Lee's disappearance, Ms. Lee had purchased the pills from a nearby pharmacy and presented the prescription. This indirectly confirmed that she had poisoned Mr. Lee before strangling him. When police presented evidence that doxylamine had also been found in Mr. Park's body, Ms. Lee changed her statement and told the following story. In 1985, Ms. Lee worked at a sewing factory in Seoul. She was 22 at the time. There she met a man named Mr. Park, who was a year older than her. The couple quickly began a romantic relationship, and Ms. Lee became pregnant. The couple decided to move to Pochin, where Mr. Park's parents lived. There they officially married, and soon after their first son was born, followed 3 years later by their second. The pig farm where Mr. Park worked was quite far from their home, so he persuaded Ms. Lee to move so he wouldn't have to spend so much time commuting. Until 1995, the family lived a relatively happy life until one day an accident occurred. The younger son, who was 6 years old at the time, was returning home from school. He was standing at an intersection waiting for the green light. Suddenly, a truck came around a bend at high speed. The driver lost control of his vehicle and it overturned. Sand poured from the cargo area onto the 6-year-old boy. Unfortunately, he died at the scene. The loss of their child was a tragedy for the entire family, but it hit Ms. Lee particularly hard psychologically. She was diagnosed with depression. To treat her anxiety and insomnia, her doctor prescribed strong sedatives and sleeping pills. The tragedy also negatively impacted the couple's relationship. Ms. Lee claimed that her son would still be alive if they hadn't moved to the area at her husband's insistence. Mr. Park, in turn, blamed Ms. Lee, arguing that, as a mother, she should have taken better care of her child, dropping him off at school and picking him up. The daily arguments and mutual accusations continued for several years. Gradually, the couple became estranged. Mr. Park stayed late at work and sometimes even didn't return home for several days. In 2003, Mr. Park began an affair and spent a lot of time with his new lover. Once, he disappeared for a whole month. When Ms. Lee learned where her husband was, her anger at him intensified and she wanted revenge. She began meeting and dating men, but Mr. Park didn't care. He didn't react to his wife's behavior. In 2004, when Ms. Lee's mental condition became critical, she decided to take more radical revenge on her husband. One autumn evening, she gave him a glass of water in which she had dissolved a large amount of sleeping pills and blood pressure medication. At the time, Mr. Park was suffering from a sinus infection, and Ms. Lee said she had prepared a remedy for the inflammation. Ms. Lee watched her husband die in front of her, but showed no emotion. Once she was convinced that Mr. Park was dead, she wrapped him in a blanket and placed him in a kimchi container. After her husband's death, Ms. Lee skillfully concealed the truth, giving various reasons for Mr. Park's absence. She even fabricated a story that Mr. Park had run off with another woman. Everyone knew about the couple's difficult relationship and believed Ms. Lee's words. Everyone felt sorry for her, and Mr. Park's parents even felt guilty that their son had done such a thing to his family. After getting rid of her husband, Ms. Lee continued to lead a chaotic life. She had brief affairs with numerous men and often brought them home with her. In 2006, Ms. Lee gave birth to a boy with a Bangladeshi man with whom she had a brief affair. Ms. Lee showed neither anticipation nor joy at the birth of the child. She often neglected the child's care and failed to fulfill her maternal duties. After her lover, Mr. Lee, disappeared from her life in 2013, she constantly left her son home alone. While she initially stayed away for a few hours, she soon stayed away for several days. To distract the child and drown his crying, she always played the television loudly. Ms. Lee only came home for a few minutes to bring the child something to eat. Usually it was milk and bread that she had bought at the nearest store. The boy spent his entire 8 years of life indoors. He was never outside and had no contact with other people. The child was constantly hungry. He immediately ate the bread and milk his mother brought him and went hungry for the rest of the day. Over time, he realized that he had to share food and eat only a little to last longer because he didn't know when his mother would visit him again. Due to malnutrition, the boy was very thin and much smaller than other children his age. At 8, he looked 5 or 6. The child's only entertainment was watching television. Experts believe that this is why his eyes turned blue as he was constantly in a dimly lit room and stared at the television screen all day. Initially, police suspected that the Sri Lankan man with whom Ms. Lee was hiding might be their accomplice, but the suspicion was dropped when it was discovered that he had only arrived in South Korea 6 months earlier. In February 2015, Ms. Lee's case went to court. She was charged with double murder, concealing a corpse, and child abuse. The woman was sentenced to 24 years in prison but disagreed with the sentence, appealed, and again changed her statement. Ms. Lee began claiming that her husband, Mr. Park, had died of natural causes. She had only hidden his body because she loved him very much and didn't want to be separated from him. Her older son confirmed this statement, adding that he had helped his mother place his father's body in a container. The boy agreed to undergo a lie detector test. To everyone's surprise, he told the truth. Despite this, no charges could be brought against him because in South Korea, the statute of limitations for concealing a crime is 7 years. The prosecution could not prove that Ms. Lee was involved in her husband's death, although doxylamine was found in his system. The exact dosage could not be determined. Therefore, even if Ms. Lee had planted drugs in her husband's body, it could not be claimed that the amount would have been lethal. Therefore, the charge of murdering her husband was dropped. The final conviction was also influenced by the woman's unstable mental state. It turned out that, in addition to long-term depression, she also suffered from borderline personality disorder, which is why she was ultimately sentenced to 18 years in prison. Ms. Lee attempted to appeal the verdict, but all her attempts were unsuccessful. A criminal psychologist who spoke with Ms. Lee and examined her case concluded that she also suffered from compulsive hoarding. People with this diagnosis never throw anything away. For them, there is simply no such thing as trash. Every object is extremely important. This explains not only why Ms. Lee's apartment was cluttered with junk, but also her desire to preserve the bodies of her husband and former lover. Her older son recounted that his mother began behaving strangely after the death of her child in 1995. She began collecting various objects. For a while, her husband and son made sure Ms. Lee didn't clutter the apartment, but when she was alone, no one stopped her, so she let her apartment fall into disrepair. The fate of Ms. Lee's youngest son is unknown. He was cared for by social services for a while. He faced a difficult path of adjustment and integration into society. I hope he made it. He should be 18 years old by now. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves. Love can truly blind you, but sometimes it borders on madness. In some cases, it blinds you so much that you can no longer see the cruelty of loved ones. This can end terribly. Maya Chappell was born in March 2020. The girl's mother was named Dana Carr and her father was James Chappell. Dana herself came from a troubled family. Both parents had alcohol problems. Her father was violent, frequently beat both his wife and daughter. All of this left a deep scar on Dana's soul. She ran away from home as soon as she could support herself. This probably happened just in time. Shortly before Maya's birth, Dana's father was convicted of murder. The man ended up in prison while his 17-year-old daughter began a relationship with James Chappell, who was already 21. Many considered Dana too immature for a serious relationship, marriage, and even more so for motherhood. But she desperately longed for love. Her boyfriend also offered her the opportunity to escape her dangerous family. They married and prepared for the birth of their child. After her father began serving his prison sentence, her mother filed for divorce and met a new man. He proved to be a more decent person quickly, found common ground with Dana, and treated her little Maya very lovingly. Unfortunately, the relationship with James did not allow the young mother to get what she wanted. The marriage fell apart before her eyes. Shortly after Maya's birth, Dana and James separated. This was in early summer 2022. The young mother had no plans to return to her parents' home, but there was no need as Dana began relationship with Michael Damon almost immediately. Their relationship developed very quickly. By the end of August 2022, the young people moved in together. Despite James's efforts to get rid of the girl, Maya remained with her mother. Her new boyfriend was unemployed and Dana worked almost non-stop to support the entire family. Money was tight, so they saved on everything, including childcare and daycare. When Dana went to work, she left her daughter with her boyfriend. The girl's father rarely saw his daughter due to his ex-wife's ban. All of this happened in the small town of Chawton Colliery in Great Britain. It seemed as if everything was going on as usual and nothing portended trouble until one day, September 28, 2022, around 10:00 a.m., Michael's stepfather, Carl Gallagher, came to their home. At that point, the couple had already been living together for a month. According to Dana, everything was fine. When the man showed up, Maya acted very anxiously, as if afraid of Michael. When asked about his suspicious behavior, the young man replied that he had argued on the phone with several banks that were supposed to grant him a loan but had refused. Business was slow and he was trying to resolve his financial problems. But the young man was able to convince his stepfather that everything was fine and there was no cause for concern. After the man's departure, Michael attempted to obtain payment of Social Security benefits and also approached several other banks and organizations for a loan. However, he was also rejected there due to a lack of work and income. That afternoon, the man approached Dana and explained that her daughter had lost consciousness. The girl was also having trouble breathing, so he asked his girlfriend to come home. She agreed and immediately reported home. Immediately after this call, Michael called the British Ambulance Service on 999. When paramedics and police arrived at the house, they found Maya in critical condition. The girl was taken to the Royal Victoria Infirmary in Newcastle. She was unconscious, and for the next 2 days, doctors desperately fought for her life. Sadly, Maya died in the hospital without regaining consciousness. An autopsy was performed, which revealed the girl had multiple brain injuries. 5 witnesses immediately stated that these injuries could have been caused by violence against the child. The doctors who treated the girl were shocked by the extent of the abuse. Maya had extensive injuries all over her body, but it was impossible to determine exactly what had happened to her. Large bruises and marks in various stages of healing were even found in intimate areas. Although no signs of rape could be found, the bruises indicated that most of the injuries had occurred. On September 28, the very day everything had gone wrong for Michael from the very beginning, Dana and Michael were interrogated separately. Both denied that the girl had been abused. However, both had numerous excuses. They claimed that the child was very lively, ran around a lot, and fell often, which was why she had caused the bruises herself. The doctors, however, refuted these statements. Doctors believed that under no circumstances could the child have gotten into such a state on her own. Investigators began investigating the little girl's death. Michael and Dana's families noticed that Maya had bruises on her body just a few days after the couple had moved in together. These were first discovered on August 26. At that time, neighbors were out walking with their children and met Dana's daughter. Everyone saw the injuries on her head, which the girl tried to conceal with her daughter's hair. The next day, they met with relatives. Michael's family also joined the group. They all noticed that Maya was injured. This time, the young parents said the child had fallen from a slide. Dana readily confirmed her friend's story. At this point, they managed to calm everyone down. Although they were hardly believed at the meeting, as the bruises were visible not only on Maya's head but also on her left ear. It is difficult to imagine under what circumstances such an injury could occur accidentally on the body. There were also pinpoint marks around the jaw, like bruises left by fingers. On September 5, Michael called his girlfriend at work and told her that Maya was having trouble breathing. When Dana was able to take time off work and returned home, everything was fine, but new marks had appeared on the child's body. The boyfriend immediately attributed these to accidental falls in the yard where they had been walking while her mother was at work. Dana herself took the girl for a walk the next day. Several acquaintances immediately noticed a noticeable cut on her nose. A few days later, the girl had a split lip. The excuses were roughly the same every time. She was running, fell, bumped herself. Then the child was taken to Dana's mother for a short time so that her grandmother could spend some time with her. She had a good relationship with her stepfather. That same evening, while the child was being bathed, the husband noticed bruises all over the child's body. He even took a photo and sent it to Dana, after which he advised her to take the girl to the hospital. She followed this advice. When the doctor asked what was wrong, Dana told the usual stories, that the child was clumsy and very lively, constantly bumping into objects in the room and on the street. The doctor believed her. No one contacted law enforcement. On September 14, Maya visited the kindergarten for the first time, which was not far from the couple's apartment. Such visits served as an acclimatization to the kindergarten. The child liked it very much, but it was the only time she visited, as questions immediately arose from the staff about the origin of the injuries. The young mother stopped taking the girl there. Even the teachers approached her and tried to persuade her to place Maya in this group, but Dana refused, stating that she didn't want the child or was sick. Eventually, she was quickly dropped. On September 15, the daughter was supposed to be handed over to her biological father, James, but Dana refused, claiming that the girl was unwell due to an illness. Instead, she left her with her mother and stepfather. The man decided to take the child to his relative, who was an experienced nurse. That day, Maya was noticed to have a large, strange bruise on her buttocks. It wasn't visible under the diaper, but when the diaper was removed, it was clearly visible. The bruise worried the stepfather and the nurse. They turned to Dana for an explanation. Dana referred them to Michael, who assured them that the child had bitten herself. This all sounded absurd, so they decided to take some photos to document this strange injury. While the stepfather spoke to Dana on the phone, Michael repeated several times in the background that he wasn't to blame, even though no one had accused him of anything. The couple's behavior seemed even more suspicious. The following weekend, Maya visited her relatives again. New injuries were discovered, including 4 bruises on her chest. What was most impressive was the young mother's composure, as she continued to stubbornly attribute everything to coincidence. On September 27, Michael called Dana at work and said that Maya had another bruise which she had sustained while playing outside. Despite all these disturbing incidents, Dana remained calm and continued to go to work, leaving her child alone with Michael every day. As it turned out, she had repeatedly lied to the child's father, her stepfather and mother, the kindergarten teachers, and her employer about Maya's condition and health. All of this was done to conceal the true culprit for the bruises, which investigators said was Michael. Dana was the first to be interrogated and continued to lie to justify her lies. She even fabricated a story that she was pregnant at the time of Maya's abuse and then suffered a miscarriage due to the stress when the girl died. This allowed her to attribute everything to emotional shock. They were unable to obtain any valuable information from Dana, but the concerned family members were far more talkative. During the investigation into the alleged murder, Dana broke up with her boyfriend but immediately began a new relationship. Just a few weeks later, she became pregnant again and was now expecting a son. However, the young mother was considered a suspect in the girl's murder. After the birth of her son, he was taken into social services. Michael behaved equally immaturely. First, he accused Dana's mother of hitting her, then her stepfather, and finally the child's biological father. However, the investigators were convinced that the systematic abuse of the girl was connected to him, as the child's bruises always appeared when she was alone with Michael. All that remained was to find a motive, and that didn't take long to arrive. It was suspected that the young man was simply taking out his anger on the girl. This anger, in turn, was related to Michael's debts and the threats he received because he couldn't pay them. September 28th was a very unfortunate day for Dana's boyfriend. First, dealers came to him and claimed he owed them a large sum of money. These problems had been going on for a long time. For several months, they had been trying quite aggressively to collect the debt. The young man was being followed but not yet attacked. He was once again able to convince the dealers that they would receive the money shortly. In fact, he didn't have the required amount, so he looked for a way to get it. Michael called the social services, which provide social assistance, but without success. Then he turned to banks, also without success. He then spent 16 minutes on the phone trying to get money, but that didn't work either. This bad news completely upset the man, and he likely took his anger out on the little girl. What had happened was a severe blow to the child's biological father. According to James, he had tried to protect the little girl for 2 years. It was clear to the young man that Dana was a bad mother and incapable of providing for Maya. When she filed for divorce, Dana claimed the relationship was toxic and that James was aggressive and violent. But all of this was just as much a lie as the other stories the woman had fabricated. In reality, the husband simply saw Dana's emotional immaturity and inexperience and was trying to get her to finally grow up and take responsibility for herself, her family, and her child. James was also convinced that Dana would take revenge and feared that this anger might also affect Maya. Although the allegations of her ex-husband's aggressive behavior could not be proven, Dana was granted custody and James was only allowed to see his daughter on weekends. Although his ex-wife initially tried to completely cut off contact between the father and the girl, despite his right to see his daughter, Dana prevented him at every opportunity and sometimes under various pretexts prevented the child from being taken to her father. James rarely had contact with his daughter. When he saw the first bruises, the young father questioned Dana. She gave the usual excuses for accidental injuries and then practically stopped bringing the girl to see her to avoid having to listen to her ex-husband's accusations. James was certain that if she wasn't involved in the systematic beatings of Maya, she was at least covering for her boyfriend, who was responsible. James suspected something was wrong with the man from the start, but Dana described the relationship between her daughter and her boyfriend as almost ideal. She said that Michael treated the girl like his own daughter, as if they spent all their free time together, going for walks, watching movies, playing games. However, the truth was far from this lie. Most likely, Dana used this deception to anger the girl's biological father. She simply wanted to hurt him. When James noticed the first bruises on his daughter's body, he first checked Michael's records in police databases. He suspected that the boy had several criminal records. To his surprise, however, he discovered that Michael had no criminal record. Despite Dana's assurances that these were coincidences, her ex-husband noticed how the child's behavior changed during the rare and brief visits. The father noticed that Maya's behavior deteriorated drastically. The girl became disobedient, very nervous, cried constantly, and slept poorly. The father directly linked all this to the negative influence of her mother and her new boyfriend, but could not prove anything. In fact, during this time, Michael was under constant pressure from creditors demanding money. This was probably reflected in Maya. He had accumulated very large debts for illegal substances. The dealers who had sold him the illegal substances were demanding their money. They were becoming increasingly threatening. Once, when James came to pick up his daughter from the house where she lived with Dana and Michael, he saw broken windows. Both blamed the damage on some thugs, but it later turned out that it was the dealers trying to intimidate the debtor. On his next visit, the house was smeared with paint. Furthermore, his ex-wife said that someone had pulled the fuses from the fuse box the day before James arrived, leaving them without power for almost a day until they figured out what had happened. Dana tried to convince her ex-husband that they were some kind of thugs or stalkers. It's hard to say whether she was simply lying or whether the young mother genuinely didn't know what was going on in the house. When the biological father suspected his daughter's abuse, he wanted to gather and document evidence to file a full complaint. Unfortunately, at that time, the girl's biological mother allowed virtually no contact with her daughter. She canceled the weekend handover several times under various pretexts. Sometimes she claimed the child was sick, sometimes that the daughter didn't want to go to her father. Therefore, James could do nothing to protect the girl. Now it became clear that all this had been done intentionally to allow the child's bruises to heal and to avoid any awkward questions. As soon as the child finally visited her biological father, Dana again looked for excuses for new injuries and said that Maya had spent several days with her grandparents. Now they were to blame for not looking after the child. Much to James's dismay, Maya's age made it very difficult for her to express herself. Her father tried to talk to her about the matter, but every time he pointed to the bruises, the girl made gestures as if something were hitting her and said, "Die." Only later did James understand that she was referring to Michael, derived from the surname Damon. Of course, this wasn't enough to accuse him of abusing the little girl until it was too late. During the investigation, after reviewing the suspects' correspondence and phone numbers, a wealth of information was obtained. It seemed as if Dana didn't realize what was really going on and readily believed every lie Michael told her. Most often, he said Maya had fallen on the playground while they were out for a walk, or that she had run into something at full speed in the house. Before meeting this young man, nothing like this had ever happened in the child's life. But even these drastic changes didn't arouse suspicion in the biological mother. She continued to firmly believe what she was being told. The situation worsened due to impunity. When James began actively investigating the child's condition, Dana became suspicious and seriously spoke to her partner, as Maya did indeed have several strange bruises that resembled bites. Michael then came up with the strangest excuse. He claimed the girl was biting herself. This led investigators to wonder why, despite all the strange injuries and her boyfriend's suspicious behavior, didn't Dana contact a medical center, the police, or other professionals. The young mother cited her inexperience. When all the family members began asking uncomfortable questions about the girl's injuries, Michael simply said that he would no longer be with Maya if she didn't stop asking all these questions and interfering in his affairs. Contrary to expectations, Dana did not react clearly to this statement. She tried to convince her boyfriend that she believed him and began to justify her behavior and the need to save money. The dialogue ended with Dana confessing her love to him, telling him that she trusted him and wanted him to continue looking after their daughter. Instead of checking Michael's suspicions, she continued to justify him. Even when she was shown photos of her beaten daughter, she assured everyone that Maya would have been even more seriously injured without her boyfriend's supervision. James was shocked by his ex-wife's naivety, but unfortunately there was nothing he could do about it. Several times, the messages between the lovers ended with Michael assuring Dana that he would never touch her daughter under any circumstances, and she assured him that she would never think so badly of him. Even when Michael was on this, after writing on the fateful day that Maya was suffocating, the young mother ended the brief conversation by saying that she loved her boyfriend and didn't want to lose him. It seemed as if she wasn't at all worried about her child's fate. When the child was found alive in the house, suspicions of domestic violence immediately arose. The hospital counted more than 50 bruises in various stages of healing on her body. Among them were very suspicious marks resembling bite marks. After the autopsy, the forensic pathologist concluded that the child had been beaten for an extended period of time with a blunt object, likely an adult's fists. Everything pointed to Michael. Most of the injuries were in the girl's head and abdomen. It was suspected that she had been violently thrown to the ground. According to the surgeon who tried to save Maya, she looked as if she had fallen from a great height or been involved in a high-speed car accident. Only when she heard these terrible suspicions did Dana finally begin to suspect something, as is evident from her confession. However, investigators assumed that the mother was once again feigning because the child's condition was not the result of spontaneous actions but of systematic abuse by her partner. This was no secret to her. Everyone around her talked about it and asked the young mother to think about it. When police and paramedics arrived at the couple's home to take Maya to the hospital, 27-year-old Michael was arrested. He was suspected of domestic violence. The man was interrogated but admitted nothing. When the girl died in the hospital, the young man was charged with murder. He was interrogated again, now as the prime suspect, but continued to deny his guilt. On the contrary, he described his relationship with the girl as loving and mutually understanding. According to the young man, he never shouted at her or raised her voice. But on the day she suddenly stopped breathing, he sensed the child was ill. Before the 2-year-old lost consciousness, they had been playing Xbox together, then she had gone to her bedroom. Michael continued playing for about 10 minutes until he heard a loud thud coming from the child's room. He got up to see what had happened. As he got up, the noise repeated itself. He found Maya lying motionless on the floor. It looked as if the girl had fallen out of bed twice. That didn't sound convincing. He immediately noticed the child's irregular breathing and called his friend for help, brought her home, and then called the emergency services. He spoke to Michael while the paramedics were on their way and gave him detailed first aid instructions. The young man claimed to have performed artificial respiration and chest compressions. This was all a lie. Even multiple falls from the bed to the floor could not have resulted in so many bruises. Everything pointed to the child's ongoing abuse. But Michael didn't admit this. The young man's stepfather, who had stopped by their home that same morning, subsequently spoke with investigators. He was so shocked by the girl's behavior that he initially wanted to take her with him. According to the man, she cried, called for her mother, looked frightened, and even tried to hide when she saw Michael. It was obvious that the child was uncomfortable around this man. When the stepfather told the young man about this, the man said everything was fine and assured him there was nothing to worry about. Nevertheless, the man managed to record a video showing the girl's strange behavior. It was later used in court to refute Michael's statements. Investigators discovered numerous calls related to Michael's financial affairs and were shocked by the time intervals. The call to the emergency call center was made from a landline. But while the dispatcher was explaining first aid measures to the young man, another call was made to the bank. The perpetrator simply left the girl to die in the room and briefly left to apply for another loan on his cell phone. He was indifferent to her fate. In addition to all these incidents and the young man's suspicious behavior, investigators discovered that he had cheated on his girlfriend. He had a profile on an online dating website. While living with Dana, he continued to message and meet other women. A message was even found in which one of his lovers confessed to being pregnant by him. Contact with her was immediately cut off. In addition to banned substances, Michael also took steroids. This may have had significant influence on his aggressive behavior and emotional state, especially in combination with the banned substances. He simply couldn't control himself at times. Maya suffered from this. Dana continued to insist that she had no knowledge of any of this. The young mother was also arrested and charged with abusing her daughter. It was believed that her indifference had contributed to the domestic violence. Dana had been informed of the situation but had done nothing to protect her daughter from the beatings. Instead, she supported Michael and said she would not leave him. Dana's trial began in October 2023. At that time, she stated that she had been so obsessed with her boyfriend that she had been blind. She simply hadn't noticed what was happening and hadn't believed her relatives that her partner was harming her daughter. According to her statements, the young mother was unaware of the consequences of her boyfriend's behavior. For a while, Dana didn't even understand that the police were blaming her for what had happened. When the lawyer was able to convey these simple truths to his client, she changed her behavior. It seemed as if the young mother was now showing remorse. However, hardly anyone truly believed her. Everyone thought Dana was just trying to avoid prison. During the trial, the defense attorney attempted to portray her as a victim who had long suffered violence in her family during her childhood at the hands of her brutal father. In the end, she killed someone. Dana had become accustomed to the brutal treatment, which had become normal. For her, the emotional trauma had distorted her mind and prevented her from understanding what this could mean for the little girl. All of the attorney's arguments could only move the jury, as they in no way justified their indifference toward the girl. In court, Dana stated that she was now uncomfortable being in the same room with Michael. However, she refuted her tearful stories with another lie. According to Dana's earlier statements, she had suffered a miscarriage after the girl's death, a story the investigators already knew. Now she went even further. While she had spoken of a simple pregnancy during interrogations, she now spoke of twins with Michael. As before, her fate ended tragically. Now Dana claimed she had terminated the pregnancy when she realized that Michael had killed her daughter. The defendant wanted nothing more to do with him and did not want to have any children with him. This argument was immediately refuted by the prosecution, as there were no medical records confirming a pregnancy, miscarriage, or abortion. This lie somewhat damaged Dana. The prosecution believed that she had lied, shown criminal indifference toward the girl, and simply ignored obvious dangers. Further evidence of the mother's indifference was the fact that, although she had separated from Michael after her daughter's death, but immediately found a new boyfriend, started a relationship with him, became pregnant, and gave birth to a son. All of this did not resemble mourning for her murdered daughter. After the trial, 24-year-old Dana was sentenced to 9 years in prison. Later, the trial of Michael Damon began. Unlike Dana, he refused to defend himself. His defense attorney insisted that his client had no sadistic motives, no premeditation or planning for the girl's murder, making it an accident. Despite all these pathetic attempts to exonerate the defendant, Michael was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. However, the court showed leniency and granted the murderer the right to early release after 21 years. The child's funeral took place on November 4, 2022. Following this tragic event, James wrote a final message for his daughter on his social media page. He said goodbye to his little daughter, apologized for not being able to protect her, and promised her that they would definitely see each other again. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.